Okay, I want to lay down some context for the discussion of these late 20th century texts. Of course, we're reading texts that are sort of disparate in when they were written and in subject matter. Fahrenheit 451 was written in 1950. The Handmaid's Tale in the 1980s, and of course, The Matrix was made right at the end of the 20th century. 1999 is when that came out. And so things changed a great deal over a roughly 50-year period, right? But some of this context will be relevant to some of the works, and other parts of it will be relevant to other works. But generally speaking, these are the kind of the things that influenced the ideas about dystopia the most. A big one is the Cold War, and so immediately after World War II, and in fact even before the war was fully over. Churchill and Roosevelt and later Truman were starting to talk about how they needed to get as far east as they possibly could because they knew that the Soviet Union would not relinquish any territory that it controlled at the end of the war, and that it would seek to establish these kind of barrier states to protect itself in the future. Soviet security, this sense of this idea that they needed security from the aggression of their Western European neighbors was a kind of paranoia that went back centuries. It's political scientists often joke, like, what would be an appropriate buffer, that Russia would want? Probably somewhere west of Paris, actually, that they would want to control all of Europe. When the war ended, they had occupied countries like Poland and Czechoslovakia and all the countries of the Balkan Peninsula, the Baltic states like Estonia and Latvia and Lithuania, and they set out to incorporate some of these territories into the Soviet Union. So Ukraine and the Baltic states and places like Georgia and Belarus and Moldova became part of the Soviet Union, and then others were left independent, so to speak, but really with puppet regimes controlled from Moscow under the direction of kind of localized communist parties. Everything from East Germany to Poland to Czechoslovakia to Hungary. All of these became communist countries. Yugoslavia was another one that kind of joined together all of these countries in the Balkan Peninsula. And so this created a great deal of tension. Winston Churchill in the 1950s, in a speech in Missouri, described it as an iron curtain descending over Eastern Europe. And that's where that famous phrase came from. This was maybe signified best by the Berlin Wall, because the city of Berlin was divided between the kind of liberal democracies of the United States and Britain and France, and East Berlin was controlled by the Soviets, right? So the Cold War brought about a lot of tension, and there's a lot to do with this, but maybe the most frightening aspect of the Cold War was that both sides came to have nuclear weapons. By the end of the 1940s, really in rather short order after the war, the Soviet Union developed nuclear weapons, exploded an atomic bomb, started to use nuclear energy, and it became an arms race, right? And so having seen the destruction caused at Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan at the end of the World War II, and then seeing, footage, video and photographic footage of these nuclear weapon tests, like the one pictured here on the slide at the bottom left. This was I think somewhere between 10 and 15 megaton. So this was already the hydrogen bomb. These are much bigger nuclear weapons than the ones that had been used on Japan. This was exploded in the Pacific island of Bikini Atoll, and it caused this what looked like kind of end of the world explosion, this massive mushroom cloud. And so the end of the world looked like it was well in sight, if not likely, right? That one side or the other was going to eventually release nuclear weapons. This would lead to sort of full-scale nuclear war, and that the world on the other side of that apocalypse would look very different. If humanity actually survived it would be in a kind of wasteland, a post-apocalyptic, dystopic wasteland. And so this animated works of fiction, whether it was in novels or films, or even newly emergent media like comic books, sometimes explored post-apocalyptic, post-nuclear apocalyptic scenarios. There are a number of books I would recommend if you're interested in this topic, fictionalized accounts. My favorite probably is Walter Miller's 1957 novel, A Canticle for Leibowitz. I have assigned that book in connection with classes on utopia and dystopia before, but I sort of took it off of the reading list. It is one of my very favorite books of all time, though. And it kind of sets up a scenario of, post-apocalyptic dystopia, what's going to happen, what are human beings going to do. There were a number of works of film that explored similar issues. Maybe most famously, the 1951 film The Day the Earth Stood Still was a big one. The 1964 film Fail Safe got into some of this. There was the film Them, which was about gigantic ants, but this is, and then even Godzilla, right, was of course a kind of Japanese take on the consequences of nuclear weapons. So we're going to create these monsters somehow, these mutated monsters. On the Beach was another popular movie from the early 1960s, where the scenario there is that most of the world has been destroyed by nuclear weapons, and the remaining population is in Australia, and they know that the fallout clouds are coming, and they've got only a few days or weeks sort of to prepare themselves for the annihilation of humanity, right? So, and then explores the psychology of all of that. What are people going to do? Perhaps most entertainingly was the film Dr. Strangelove, 1965, which I have shown in a number of classes that I've taught before. It captures a lot of this, but at the very end of the film, you get the characters like the deal is sealed, so to speak. The nuclear weapons are going to destroy everything, and it's like, okay, well we're going to take as many human beings as we can and create a society deep in mine shafts, and we'll have to be there for 100 years, and what's that going to look like? Well, it looks a great deal like a dystopia, right? So nuclear weapons are really important. In Fahrenheit 451, it's obvious that there are nuclear weapons. In fact, at one point, Guy Montag says, we've started and won 2 atomic wars since, and actually it depends on the edition that you're reading in. In the edition I have, I think it says 1960. I've got an older edition, but then, that was changed later to 1990, and now I think it's like 2022 in the most recent edition is what it says. But we've started and won 2 atomic wars since that year, and, nobody is even aware of what's going on because of the next issue, which is the growth of mass media. We're entertaining ourselves to death. And this started with, with Aldous Huxley in Brave New World, but this is explored to an even greater degree, I think, in Fahrenheit 451. It's like, okay, we've got these things now that entertain us so much, entertain our eyes, that we're not thinking about what we're doing. We're not even aware of what's going on around us. That's the really dystopic quality of something like Fahrenheit 451. Mildred Montag, the wife of Guy, is so busy watching her wall-to-wall televisions. Three of their 4 screens in their parlor are televisions, and she wants the 4th wall made into it. That she is, totally unaware of what's happening in the world around her, right? Totally unaware of kind of the consequences. She doesn't even realize that she has tried to commit suicide. She's that unhappy, but, kind of that's only at a subconscious level that unhappiness manifests itself. And so, this is, I think television in particular becomes a very powerful medium because it's in the home. You don't have to go to the movies. You can just turn on your television and be entertained immediately, right? So, mass media, and this just accelerates over the course of the 20th century. Accompanying that, of course, is the growth of technology. You've got the picture of the Apple II computer, which was the first kind of mass-produced, or one of the first, I should say, mass-produced computers that made it into a lot of homes in the late 1970s and early 1980s. But once computers are developed and the kind of capabilities of processing information come into being with computers, and especially with kind of extensions of that, like the potential growth of AI, artificial intelligence, right? People begin to think about the consequences of this, and that makes it into dystopia. In the 1950s, the science fiction writer Isaac Asimov is already writing about robots and whether they can become sentient in books like I, Robot. And this just continues. Philip K. Dick in the 1960s writes this novel called Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, where in that scenario, you can't even tell who is human and who is an android. And perhaps the humans and the androids don't even know themselves. And that's one of the kind of frightening aspects of it. That book, by the way, was later made in 1982 into the film Blade Runner with Harrison Ford. And then there, of course, was a sequel with Ryan Gosling just a few years ago. So, the growth of technology, the potential for artificial intelligence, robots, and so forth and so on, right? The machines gaining sentience. This, of course, is seen in The Matrix. And so we'll say more about that when we talk about that film. Environmental concerns manifest as well in dystopic fiction. What are we doing to the world? What are the consequences of pollution, of creating sort of a toxic atmosphere with everything from pollutants from factories to nuclear fallout, right? What are going to be the results of this? What will happen to humanity when we destroy the environment of the earth, right? That is not so much in the works that we're looking at, although there's the kind of haunting scene in The Matrix where Morpheus says, we're not sure exactly how this all happened, but we know that we were the ones who scorched the sky, whatever that means. I think that really means destroyed the atmosphere. Okay, so that enters into a lot of this thinking about dystopia. I need to bring up feminism because this is one of the key things animating Margaret Atwood's *Handmaid's Tale*. But we have first wave feminism, which is kind of the growth of female intellectuals calling for recognition of women as a subject of study worthy in its own right. Figures like Simone de Beauvoir, who writes this work called *The Second Sex* in the 1940s. It starts with a kind of intellectual movement, but then it becomes a protest movement in the 1970s in particular. And so that's second wave feminism, and that continues after that, right? Feminism is as I said, the key animating principle in The Handmaid's Tale. It's like, if we have the kind of dystopia which is set up there, which is a kind of religious-based dystopia, what's going to happen to women with the strictures placed by some religions, at least, on women, and all of these rights and privileges and things that women were fighting for in feminism. Atwood says those have been taken away, and women have been reduced to their most basic domestic roles, informed by religion, that they are to have babies, that they're to take care of the house and cook and clean, and they're to be supportive wives, right, while the men make all of the decisions. Feminism points out the inequities of all of that, and Atwood takes that and runs with it, and there are elements of this in other dystopias as well. Should point out also, because this is another key factor in The Handmaid's Tale, but we see this actually in a number of works. The political polarization in the United States and elsewhere, much of the mass media is being produced in the United States and imitated in other places. That's not to say that other places don't have their own versions of this. They certainly do. But these works that we're reading and Watching were produced in North America. Right, Atwood's a Canadian author, I suppose, but her novel takes place in the potential future United States. The emergence of the religious right, starting in the 1950s with popular preachers like Billy Graham, who becomes a spiritual advisor to President Eisenhower. He is the one largely responsible for the establishment of the national slogan, "In God We Trust," which ends up on coins and things like that, right? Through the growth of other kind of the ones who follow in the wake of Billy Graham, like Jerry Falwell and Jimmy Swaggart and others, Pat Robertson. We have, Christian broadcasting, the religious right producing its own media. One of the kind of post-apocalyptic, or at least, apocalyptic informed works that is one of the most popular of the 20th century is this book written by a Christian author named Hal Lindsey called Late Great Planet Earth, which is really just about the end times, ushering in the second coming of Jesus Christ. Following in that wake, that was published in the 1970s. In the 1990s, Tim LaHaye writes this work called Left Behind, which you may be aware of, that was made into a set of films starring Kirk Cameron of kind of 1980s sitcom fame. That also is the scenario of the rapture has happened and there are only a few people left behind, right? And they need to decide whether they're going to follow the Christian way and prepare for the second coming of Christ. And so, this is informing a lot of this end time thinking, and that enters in to potential apocalyptic scenarios. Left Behind really is sort of dystopic in its nature, in its own way, right? But then so are also our responses or dystopias evincing fears of the growth of the religious right, like The Handmaid's Tale. Moral issues, so-called, and I've put quotes around that, like abortion, and the supposed challenges to the traditional family, rights for LGBT Q people and so forth and so on, right, become battlegrounds politically. And this enters into and inflects thinking about dystopia all the way to the present, and I assume it will continue. And then we might say simply the popularity of the genre really gains traction in the starting in maybe the 1980s or so, but evidence of that would be a work like The Hunger Games, which is written for a teen/young adult audience. It deals with rather grim things. That story is dark. That you have, this scenario where children are fighting to the death, right, for the entertainment of this privileged population. That's the stuff of dystopic nightmares, but it's then marketed to teenagers to read about. And the heroine, Katniss Everdeen, is kind of a teenage girl who's really good with a bow and all of that, right? So the genre just gains popularity to the point where the bookshelves of places like Barnes & Noble are just stuffed with dystopia after dystopia after dystopia, much of which I will say in my own opinion is pretty subpar, but audiences just can't get enough of this, and this is, I think, continued to the present, and I don't know when it will end. So hopefully that gives us a good sense of some context there. And we'll look in subsequent videos at the specific works as we've done in the past.